The Thrix ship, a massive structure composed of shifting nanomaterials, hovered silently above Earth's surface, its smooth, reflective hull blending with the stars. Inside the diplomatic suite, Lieutenant Alex Carter sat in front of the Thrix ambassador, X-Tool, who was perched on an organic chair that seemed to melt into the air itself. Carter had been assigned to the initial meeting because of his reputation, his calm under pressure, his extensive knowledge of human history, and his background as a decorated officer who'd fought in the Sol Wars. X-Tool's alien form was unlike anything human eyes had ever seen. A tall, slender body composed of fluid, semi-transparent skin that pulsed with an inner glow. His face was a smooth, featureless plane, yet somehow expressive through subtle shifts in color and light. Despite his species' intelligence, perhaps even because of it, Tool had been somewhat cold and dismissive of humans when he first arrived on Earth. To him, humanity's place in the galaxy was as a fledgling power, impressive in their numbers and resourcefulness, but primitive compared to the Thrix mastery over technology. And now, X-Tool found himself seated across from a human soldier, an Arctic man in an otherwise ultra-modern world. Carter leaned back slightly, his fingers gently brushing the worn handle of the pistol holstered at his side. It was an old Earth model, a revolver from the 21st century, with a gleaming barrel and wood-grain grip. He could feel the weight of it, the weight of history, the weight of family. "Lieutenant," X-Tool began, his voice smooth but tinged with an unmistakable sense of curiosity. "I studied your species for some time, but one thing I cannot reconcile is your continued reliance on these artifacts." He gestured toward the sidearm. "Why does humanity insist on using weapons that are so inefficient?" Carter smiled faintly, adjusting his jacket as if the question had been expected. "It's not about efficiency, Ambassador." "Not always," he said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of something deeper, something that X-Tool hadn't yet grasped. "We don't just use weapons to fight. We use them because they carry meaning. This revolver," he patted it gently, "belonged to my great-grandfather. It's a part of who I am." X-Tool blinked, though his expression remained impassive. "But it is obsolete. You have weapons that can incapacitate entire fleets in moments. Why carry something so archaic?" The question lingered, hanging in the air between them. Carter leaned forward slightly, meeting the alien's gaze, his eyes clear and unwavering. "Because we remember. Our past is what shapes us. When we forget where we came from, we risk losing everything that makes us human." X-Tool processed the words in silence, his mind working at the speed of quantum thought. For a moment, it seemed as though the ambassador might argue again. But then, something subtle in Carter's voice, in the way his hand rested on the grip, struck a chord deep within the Thrix mind. X-Tool wasn't sure he understood the full meaning of it yet, but he knew one thing for certain. Humanity was more complicated than he'd anticipated. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to their old-fashioned weapons than mere nostalgia. The conversation shifted after that, but X-Tool's mind lingered on Carter's words, his grip on the revolver, and the strange way the human soldier carried his history like a shield. Over the next several days, X-Tool delved deeper into humanity's complex relationship with its past. The Thrix ambassador was assigned to a diplomatic exchange program in New York, but instead of participating in scheduled meetings, he chose to spend his time observing. Human culture fascinated him, but also frustrated him. He was accustomed to creatures that calculated decisions with cold precision, beings who relied on efficiency and rationality in all things. Humans, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on sentiment, emotion, and a strange form of tradition that defied logic. In one of the city's busiest districts, X-Tool watched as people walked by, heads buried in their digital screens or communicating with machines, yet a few still carried things that had little practical use in this hyper-advanced age. Old books, vinyl records, handcrafted jewelry, and, most intriguing to him, firearms. X-Tool's confusion deepened when he saw a young woman, Lieutenant Emily Ross, carrying a sleek, modern assault rifle, only to later discover that it was a carefully maintained replica of a 20th century design. It was a weapon from Earth's violent past, an iconic piece from the time of conflict. The weapon was heavier, slower, and less effective than newer models, yet she treated it with the utmost reverence. "Lieutenant Ross," X-Tool said as he approached her during a break in their scheduled activities, "may I ask why you carry that thing?" Ross glanced down at the rifle, then back at X-Tool with a knowing smile. "You mean this old relic?" she said, almost affectionately, running a hand over the worn stock. "It's a Colt M16, one of the original designs from Earth's wars of the last century. My grandfather used it in the Syrian conflict." X-Tool tilted his head. "But why keep it? It no longer serves any practical purpose." "Practical?" Ross scoffed lightly. "It's not about that. This rifle represents something more, something our people fought for. My grandfather fought for freedom, for his comrades, for family. This isn't just a weapon. It's a reminder of that struggle. It's a part of who we are." X-Tool felt a flicker of realization. Perhaps the attachment isn't to the weapon itself, but to what it represents. "Is this how all humans feel about their weapons?" he asked. Ross nodded. "It's not just about fighting or killing. It's about the stories. The ones our families passed down. The people who used these tools before us. They fought for us so we could live in peace, so we could make our own choices. It's a connection, not to the weapon, but to the fight." X-Tool was silent for a long time, processing her words. He had never fully understood the concept of legacy, of the past influencing the present in such a deep personal way. For the Thrix, history was a continuous stream of data, and their technology had rendered most conflict obsolete. The idea of holding on to symbols of violence, of personal sacrifice and struggle, was something foreign to him. "Do you ever feel that carrying such a thing holds you back?" X-Tool asked, genuinely curious. Ross shook her head, her face thoughtful. "No, it keeps us grounded. It reminds us who we fight for." For the first time since his arrival, X-Tool felt a deeper respect for humanity. The humans weren't just fighting for survival or for victory. They were fighting for something far more complex. They were fighting for meaning. And that, he realized, was something he needed to understand. X-Tool's fascination with the human attachment to weapons continued to grow, but so did his skepticism. He had spent days absorbing the human mindset, yet the complexity of their motivations eluded him. He decided that the best way to understand it was through action, a direct test, something that would challenge the human spirit and show him whether their reliance on old-fashioned weapons was truly a strength or simply a flawed attachment to the past. The Thrix embassy on Earth had access to one of the most advanced training simulators in the galaxy, a machine capable of replicating virtually any combat scenario. For his experiment, X-Tool decided to test a team of human soldiers, including Lieutenant Alex Carter, under the most grueling conditions. He set the simulation to mimic a high-stakes, high-intensity assault, an enemy force with superior numbers and technology, attacking a fortified position. The Thrix team, including X-Tool himself, would use the latest plasma rifles and energy shields, technology that could obliterate anything in their path. The human soldiers, however, were limited to their standard-issue sidearms and combat knives, the same old weapons they insisted on carrying. X-Tool's reasoning was simple. If the humans truly believed that their old-fashioned tools gave them an edge, then surely the simulation would demonstrate the folly of that belief. The odds were clearly against them. But what X-Tool didn't account for, what he hadn't prepared for, was the sheer tenacity and ingenuity with which humans approached combat. The simulation began. The simulated enemy, a band of alien raiders with superior firepower, assaulted the human position. X-Tool, wielding a plasma rifle, immediately took cover and began picking off targets with surgical precision. His mind worked at light speed, calculating trajectories, angles, and optimal shots, rendering the enemy force nearly helpless. But as the simulation progressed, something strange began to happen. The humans, including Carter, didn't retreat. They didn't panic. They adapted. Carter, with his antique revolver gripped firmly in his hand, moved with a fluidity X-Tool didn't expect. Despite the overwhelming firepower of the simulated enemy, he used his knowledge of the terrain to stay one step ahead. He ducked into cover, fired with deadly accuracy, then immediately repositioned, never staying in one place long enough to be a target. He wasn't relying on raw power. He was relying on his instincts, his experience, and his understanding of the environment. His sidearm may have been less advanced than X-Tool's plasma rifle, but Carter had something the Thrix didn't: human ingenuity. As the simulation wore on, it became clear that the human soldiers, while outmatched technologically, were holding their own. One by one, they picked off enemies using tactics that could never be modeled by a machine, using cover, psychology, and timing in ways X-Tool had never considered. Even when their ammunition ran low, they found ways to turn the environment against the attackers, setting traps, and making use of the terrain. By the time the simulation ended, X-Tool found himself standing in stunned silence. His team of Thrix soldiers had been wiped out in the crossfire. The humans, led by Carter, had achieved a stunning victory. X-Tool was shaken, but also intrigued. It wasn't the technology or the sheer strength that won the day. It was something far more subtle, something that could never be programmed into an AI or created through technology. How? X-Tool asked, his voice soft with genuine curiosity. Carter, wiping sweat from his brow, glanced at the wreckage of the simulated battlefield. "It's not the weapon," he said simply. "It's how you use it." For the first time, X-Tool realized that humanity's attachment to these old-fashioned tools was not a weakness. It was a strength, and understanding that was just the beginning. X-Tool's mind raced as he sat alone in his quarters aboard the Thrix diplomatic vessel, the faint hum of the ship's quantum engines vibrating the air around him. The results of the simulation had shaken him deeply. For the first time, he found himself questioning the absolute superiority of Thrix technology. The humans had been outgunned and outclassed, yet they had won. They had prevailed not because of raw power, but because of something far more unpredictable, something X-Tool could not quantify with his data-driven worldview. What was it about these humans? What drove them to act with such determination, to make do with inferior tools and still triumph? As he sifted through Earth's historical archives, unfamiliar stories of revolutions, global conflicts, and the rise and fall of civilizations, he began to uncover a pattern, a recurring theme that kept resurfacing. Humans thrived on adversity. The more he learned, the more he realized that what humans valued wasn't efficiency or perfection. It was resilience. He studied the accounts of Earth's great wars, the American Revolution, World War II, and even the more recent space conflicts that had defined humanity's place in the galaxy. Time and again, he read about battles where the odds were so overwhelmingly against the humans that victory seemed impossible. And yet, human forces had managed to succeed, sometimes through brute force, but often through sheer will and ingenuity. X-Tool found himself fixated on the story of a human named Sergeant James Hall, who, during the Terran-Promethean War, had single-handedly held off an alien assault with a malfunctioning plasma rifle, relying on nothing but his wits and an old-fashioned hand grenade. He had lost both legs, but he'd saved his comrades, turning the tide of battle. X-Tool pondered this idea of legacy, the way humans viewed their past, how it shaped their identity and decisions. It was unlike anything the Thrix had experienced. For his species, history was linear, data-driven, and relentlessly efficient. The past was something to be studied, not carried forward. But these humans, whether they were soldiers, civilians, or children, seemed to carry their pasts with them, living in the shadow of sacrifices made long ago. And this connection to history, to struggle and survival, was what seemed to give them strength. As X-Tool reflected, he couldn't help but marvel at the peculiar concept of honor. To a Thrix like him, honor was a primitive idea, something that often got in the way of logic and progress. But the more he examined human behavior, the more he understood that honor wasn't just a code for individual behavior. It was a way of binding people together, of creating unspoken bonds that allowed them to fight not for personal gain, but for each other, for their families, for their nations. X-Tool was interrupted from his thoughts by the sound of a chime. It was a message from Lieutenant Carter. "Ambassador, I'd like to show you something," the message read. Curious, X-Tool made his way to Carter's quarters, his mind racing. There was something more here, something Carter wanted him to see, something he had yet to understand. X-Tool arrived at Lieutenant Carter's quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel just as the ship's lights flickered, and a low, ominous alarm began to echo through the halls. The hum of the quantum engines was replaced by the sharp, high-pitched whine of emergency systems powering up. "Ambassador," Carter greeted him, his voice calm, though his face was set with the practiced alertness of a soldier. "You're going to want to see this." Before X-Tool could respond, the intercom crackled to life. "All hands, prepare for evasive maneuvers. We're under attack. Repeat, under attack by unknown assailants." The urgency in the voice was unmistakable. X-Tool's heart rate increased, not out of fear, but a natural, unbidden reaction to the suddenness of the situation. The Thrix had never been ambushed on such a scale. For all their technological prowess, they prided themselves on anticipating and controlling every outcome. This was different. Unknown assailants? X-Tool asked, his mind already spinning through possible scenarios. Pirates? Rebel factions? Carter was already pulling a combat jacket from a nearby locker and tossing another one to X-Tool. Could be. Or worse. We've got a few ships on scanners, but they're using jamming tech we haven't seen before. All we know is they're closing fast. As Carter strapped on his sidearm, his old beloved revolver, Tool's analytical mind quickly calculated the most likely attack vectors. The diplomatic vessel was not designed for combat, its purpose being to foster alliances, not to defend against hostile forces. The Thrix might have superior shields, but in the face of an unknown threat, X-Tool felt an unfamiliar stir of uncertainty. Even his own technology, though advanced, was built for wars of tactics, not the chaotic, unpredictable nature of this kind of fight. "We're likely facing a coordinated assault," X-Tool said, adjusting his own personal defense field generator. "Whatever these assailants lack in firepower, they make up for in strategy." Carter nodded grimly. "Exactly. They know how to hit us where we're vulnerable." He paused, glancing out the viewport, where the distant stars were starting to flicker with the approach of enemy ships. "We've fought worse. Stick with me, Ambassador. You'll see what happens when humans are pushed to the edge." X-Tool didn't respond immediately, but as the alarms blared and the crew mobilized for battle, something in Carter's tone struck him. The man was calm, almost unnervingly so, given the situation. Carter had fought in multiple military campaigns, yes, but there was more to it. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he moved, that felt almost instinctual. And then the attack came. The vessel shuddered as a volley of high-energy blasts struck the ship's shields. The lights flickered again, and the air grew tense with the smell of ionized metal. X-Tool's reflexes kicked in immediately, activating his nanotech-based armor and preparing for combat. The humans, however, were already ahead of him. Carter and his squad moved with a precision that was surprising given their outdated weapons. They knew exactly where to go, where to reinforce weak points, and how to use the ship's layout to their advantage. X-Tool's mind raced, analyzing the human soldiers' tactics as they worked in tandem. There was no panic, no hesitation. They responded to the situation with an almost unnatural fluidity, as if they had trained for this moment their entire lives. As the ship's defenses began to falter under the repeated barrage, Carter barked out orders, rallying his crew. "We've got to hold them off just a little longer," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. X-Tool observed, awestruck. He had seen thousands of simulations, countless battle strategies, but what he was witnessing now, this synergy, this raw, primal coordination, was something entirely different. The humans didn't rely solely on technology or superior firepower. They relied on their bond with each other, their resolve to protect what they held dear. The attack grew fiercer, the sound of incoming blasts vibrating through the ship's hull. Yet Carter and his team fought on, their weapons, antiquated by Thrick's standards, still proving effective. They moved with purpose, even as the Thrick's ambassador could see the damage accumulating. It was a battle that the humans should have lost, but they were refusing to accept it. "Tell me," X-Tool muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else, "how do you keep fighting like this?" Carter didn't hesitate to answer, his voice steady even as the ship rocked violently. "Because we have something to protect." As X-Tool watched the human soldiers' relentless determination, a thought took root in his mind, one that had not been there before. Maybe it was not the Thricks who were the apex of the galaxy. Maybe, just maybe, the humans had something the rest of them had lost along the way. Something far more powerful than technology. Something the universe couldn't measure. The attack came in waves. Each successive strike was more coordinated than the last. The unknown raiders, whoever they were, had clearly studied the ship's defensive patterns, finding weak points and exploiting them with ruthless precision. X-Tool's mind raced as he processed the data. Their weapons were advanced, laser bursts that passed through the ship's outer shields with ease, but it was their tactics that set them apart. They knew exactly where to hit, when to fall back, and how to counter the Thricks' technological advantages. Inside the ship's corridors, the human soldiers, Carter and his squad, were operating like a well-oiled machine. Their tactics were old-fashioned, relying on instincts and terrain, but they were devastatingly effective. They used the ship's narrow hallways and bulkheads to their advantage, using corners for cover and employing the kind of guerrilla tactics that had served humanity in countless wars. X-Tool moved quickly through the corridors, his nanotech armor enhancing his strength and speed, but his mind was focused elsewhere. He was impressed, astonished, even, by how these humans fought. They weren't reacting as soldiers. They were fighting like survivors. Every step they took, every move they made, spoke of a deep-seated will to endure, to protect. Their weapons might have been old, but their resolve was anything but. He followed Carter, who was leading a small squad of soldiers toward the ship's engineering bay, where the next wave of attackers was poised to breach the main reactor core. It was a key target, and if the raiders managed to disable the core, the entire ship would be lost. But Carter, with his revolver holstered and a combat knife in hand, seemed unfazed by the enormity of the task. His eyes were sharp, focused. "We hold here," Carter barked to his team as they reached a critical junction near the reactor. The sound of enemy footsteps echoed from down the hall, growing louder with every passing second. X-Tool watched as Carter gave quick, precise orders to his team, his voice calm even in the face of certain danger. "Take up positions. We hold them at the junction. No one gets past us." The humans moved with practiced efficiency. They didn't rush. They didn't overthink. They simply acted. X-Tool felt an odd sensation wash over him. For all the Thricks' advanced technology, there was something raw, something almost primal about the way the humans fought. It wasn't just about strategy or power. It was about something deeper, a need to survive, to fight for each other, for what was theirs. Moments later, the enemy rounded the corner. Raiders in black combat suits, weapons raised. They were faster, better armed, and far more numerous than the humans. But Carter's squad stood their ground. The first wave of raiders charged forward, but the humans were ready. Carter and his squad opened fire, their old weapons hissing and thudding with surprising accuracy. A few raiders dropped immediately, but there were too many. The enemy pushed forward, undeterred. X-Tool, observing from a distance, activated his own plasma rifle and took aim. Yet, even as he prepared to fire, he hesitated. He saw it now. The humans were holding, not just fighting, but defending. They weren't just trying to kill. They were fighting for something greater. For their families, for each other, for their ship. X-Tool's hesitation lasted only a moment. With a burst of plasma, he decimated the front line of raiders, clearing a path for the humans to advance. His actions, however, were far more mechanical, driven by instinct and logic. Carter and his team, though, were doing something far more complex. They were embodying the will to survive. As the battle raged on, X-Tool couldn't help but think, this was something the Thrix could never replicate. The humans had an edge, something beyond technology, something raw and untamable. It wasn't their weapons or their tech. It was their heart. And it was something the Thrix were beginning to realize they would need to understand if they ever hoped to defeat these humans in the future. The enemy retreated, but only momentarily. It was clear this was just the beginning. The ship's integrity was already compromised, and the battle for survival was far from over. But as the crew readied for the next wave, X-Tool stood alongside Carter, no longer just an observer, but a reluctant ally. He had much to learn, and the only way forward was to fight. And perhaps to fight with the humans. The ship was a maze of crumpled corridors and flickering emergency lights, the air heavy with the smell of burnt ozone and the acrid tang of overheated circuitry. Tool's enhanced vision allowed him to see every detail, every crack in the walls, every sign of damage. But it was the chaos unfolding around him that kept his attention. Human soldiers, though battered and bruised, continued to fight with a tenacity he hadn't anticipated. Even as the hull groaned under the impact of another barrage, the crew of Thrix and humans alike pressed on. Despite their technological advantage, the Thrix were beginning to struggle. Their defensive systems, sophisticated though they were, had never been tested in such close-quarters combat. The raiders had bypassed much of their external defenses, and now, with only minutes before the ship's reactor core was breached, the situation had become a desperate race against time. X-Tool, standing in the midst of it all, felt the distinct shift in his perspective. Just a few days ago, he would have considered this an inconvenience, a mere inconvenience, at worst, a reminder of why Thrix dominance was assured. But now, after observing the humans, their fearlessness in battle, their refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds, X-Tool could no longer dismiss them as a lesser species. He looked over at Lieutenant Carter, who was rallying his team near a bulkhead, barking orders, despite the blood dripping from his forehead and the dark circles beneath his eyes. The man's determination was unwavering, as if he could not even consider failure. Carter's team, though battered, was still holding ground. "You're injured," X-Tool said, stepping toward him, his voice steady despite the rising tension in the ship's corridors. Carter had been hit by a stray burst of plasma in the first wave. His uniform was singed, but he'd refused medical attention, insisting on staying in the fight. "I'm fine," Carter replied, wiping the sweat from his brow. "We need to move to the main junction now. The raiders are going to try to take out the reactor core next, and we can't let them get there." X-Tool nodded, then paused, his eyes narrowing as he processed the situation. "I've observed you and your soldiers. You fight with a sense of purpose, something beyond victory. What is it you protect?" Carter's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, the chaos around them seemed to vanish. There was a calmness to his expression that cut through the tension. "We fight for each other," he said simply. "For the crew, for humanity, because we're not just a species trying to survive. We're trying to build something better. A future. That's what we're protecting." X-Tool, for the first time, felt something stir deep within him, a feeling he couldn't quite place, but which made his calculated approach to battle feel inadequate. The Thrix had long abandoned the idea of protecting anything but their own species' supremacy. But what Carter spoke of was different. It was a concept X-Tool had never fully understood until now. Hope. A hope for a future that transcended individual survival. A hope that wasn't just rooted in technology, but in something far deeper, far more fragile. Before he could respond, an explosion rocked the ship, throwing them both off balance. The lights flickered, and the sound of the enemy's boots echoed through the corridor. The battle was about to escalate to its most critical phase. "Get ready," Carter said, his voice clipped but firm. "This isn't over yet." X-Tool stood, his plasma rifle humming to life in his hands. But for the first time, he wasn't just a soldier preparing for combat. He was something more, a reluctant ally, a witness to something human that went beyond strategy and tactics. The enemy was closing in, but as the humans moved into position, X-Tool took a step forward, not as an observer, but as part of the team. For the first time, he truly understood what Carter had meant. Humans weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for something that transcended the present. A future, a legacy that the Thrix had lost long ago. And X-Tool realized, with a growing sense of urgency, that if the Thrix were to ever truly understand the human spirit, they would have to fight alongside them. The ship groaned again, but this time, X-Tool wasn't sure whether the sound was the hull cracking under the pressure or the shifting of his own loyalties. Either way, he was no longer standing alone. The humans had made him part of something he hadn't expected. A fight for survival, yes, but also for something far more precious. Something worth protecting. The sound of boots pounding the metal floor grew louder as the raiders pressed forward. The lights overhead flickered, casting eerie shadows over the battered corridor. The reactor core was just ahead, its location now compromised, and the crew had mere minutes before the entire ship's power systems would be incapacitated. Carter's team had already positioned themselves, holding the junction with grim determination. X-Tool, now standing side by side with the humans, could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The battle was far from won. Even with the Thrix ambassador fighting alongside them, the odds still heavily favored the enemy. The ship was a fortress in name only, its advanced technology less effective when faced with the sheer unpredictability of human ingenuity and the raiders' merciless tactics. But there was something else at play now. X-Tool could feel it in his bones. The humans' fight was no longer about survival, it was about unity. The same unity Carter had described earlier. It was as if, in the face of impossible odds, humanity's strength lay not just in their weapons or technology, but in the way they bound themselves together. Carter turned to him as the enemy grew closer. "Stay with us, Ambassador. Don't let them through. We're all that's standing between them and the reactor." X-Tool nodded without a word, his mind already calculating the next move. His plasma rifle hummed to life in his hands, a sharp reminder of his people's technological supremacy. But this time, the weapon felt different. He wasn't wielding it as a Thrix soldier would, with cold efficiency and ruthless precision. No, he was standing shoulder to shoulder with humans, defending something more than just his life. He was defending the future. The enemy rounded the corner, a wave of dark figures, armored and ready. They had no intention of taking prisoners. Without hesitation, Carter and his team opened fire, their weapons blasting with precision. But the raiders pushed forward, responding with their own deadly energy weapons. Plasma blasts lit up the corridor, lighting up the darkness with their fiery explosions. The two sides clashed in a fierce, violent maelstrom, each fighting for control of the heart of the ship. X-Tool fought beside the humans, his plasma rifle cutting down the first line of attackers. But there were too many. The tide of battle was shifting. "Fall back," Carter shouted over the noise, his voice steady despite the overwhelming danger. "Regroup at the next junction." X-Tool's mind raced. He had seen the humans' tactics. They were resilient, adaptable. But now, faced with this onslaught, he wondered if even they could hold on. But as he looked at Carter, standing tall in the face of destruction, something deep within him stirred. These humans, fighting with everything they had, fighting for each other, reminded him of what it meant to truly live. "We hold this position," Carter said, his voice unwavering. "For Earth, for our families, for everything we've built. We hold." X-Tool turned to face the oncoming storm. The raiders were closing in, but they weren't fighting just for survival anymore. Neither were the humans. As the next wave of attackers surged forward, X-Tool raised his rifle. The plasma energy arced through the air, cutting through the raiders' line. One by one, they fell. But even as the tide of battle raged, X-Tool realized that his fight was no longer just a test of strength or technology. It was a fight for something deeper, something worth fighting for. The reactor core was still the prize, but it was no longer just about destroying the ship. The raiders wanted to break the spirit of the crew, to make them surrender. But X-Tool saw something now, something that went beyond calculations, beyond weapons and technology. He could feel the human resolve in the air, the pulse of their survival instinct thrumming through his veins. And as he turned back to Carter and his team, he understood that they had already won, no matter the outcome of the battle, because they were human. And that, X-Tool now knew, was something the Thrix could never defeat. As the final wave of raiders pushed forward, X-Tool stepped forward into the fray, not as an observer, but as a defender. Not as a Thrix soldier, but as part of something greater than himself. Together, they would fight to the end, and together, they would prevail.